Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Once again, good morning, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is good to be together, and I am really pleased and impressed by the turnout, so I'm really glad that you are here. Let's begin, as we begin all good things, with prayer. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Prayer for the parish. Almighty and ever-living God, ruler of all things in heaven and earth, hear our prayers for this parish family. Strengthen the faithful, arouse the careless, and restore the penitent. Grant us all things necessary for our common life, and bring us all to be of one heart and mind within your holy church, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Before I introduce Melissa, I just wanted to say a couple of words. One is, some of you may remember a couple of months ago when we first introduced this topic to the parish, the term that I used was remembering and remembering. And I shared that sermon with Melissa, and you can see that it made it into the heading of today's presentation. But I just wanted to reflect on that again, right? That we are taking now another big step toward remembering a part of our past that was forgotten, and also remembering of putting these pieces back together again in our parish. And the other thing I wanted to repeat from that sermon is a reminder that we are not guilty of anything that happened in the past, right? But we are responsible for what we do now. We are responsible for what we do now. And that's an important thing, I think, for all of us to remember. So I am very pleased to introduce Melissa Ruffner to you, and I'll share a few words about her. So Melissa Ruffner, a native of Western Pennsylvania, came to the Baltimore area to attend Goucher College. A 1985 graduate of the University of Maryland Law School, she worked for the ACLU of Maryland on education and public housing desegregation cases. After serving as the first director of a cooperative elementary school, she earned a master's degree in library science at the University of Maryland, College Park. She has worked on library, education, and archival projects at Goucher, Hampton National Historic Site, University Archives at College Park, and Drexel University. A board-certified genealogist since 2014, Melissa was the director of the Genealogical Institute on Federal Records from 2015 until 2020, and served on the board of the Maryland Genealogical Society from 2012 until 2022, including 2 years as editor of the Maryland Genealogical Society Journal. She has worked for the Georgetown Memory Project since 2016, tracing descendants of slaves held on Jesuit plantations in Maryland. And Melissa first came into our lives thanks to Jean Baker, and the first project she worked on was going through the archives of St. Thomas's Church, and she did a wonderful job with that. And then we invited her. The task was both complicated and simple, which was to learn as much as she possibly could about the North Cemetery. And Melissa has been just a delight to work with and is phenomenally talented, and I'm really glad that you are here. Thank you, Melissa.
I want to thank you for joining me today to hear about the research that it's been my pleasure and honor to do as you seek to learn more about the history of your parish. As Reverend Murphy mentioned, I was contacted last year about doing an inventory for the church's historical records. I was a little reluctant because this is a bit of a drive for me and around the Beltway. But even when it's been 40 plus years and you were a philosophy major and not a history major, when you get an email from Dr. Jean Baker, you do not decline. When I turned into the driveway, I was really struck by the beauty and the history of this place, and I was pretty sure before I walked in the door that I was going to say yes. And then as I began my work here, I was struck again by the warm welcome that I received from everyone whom I encountered along the way. And as you noticed, I have taken the title of my presentation from the sermon on Renewal Sunday, September 17th. His term, Remembering, resonated with me. My goal today is to give you a glimpse of the historic St. Thomas community with all of its members. So if you can, please hold your questions until the end. I'm only going to talk for 30 minutes, and then I'll be happy to return to any slide. For those of you who aren't able to see the intricacies of some of these slides, the live stream is going to focus on the slides, so you would be able to watch it later. But again, I will be happy to show any slide again at the end if you want to come up and look at something more closely. As Tom said on Renewal Sunday, for a couple of years, several parishioners wondered about the gravestones that are located north of the churchyard wall, the monuments that you pass on the way from the parking lot to the church. And he mentioned that the answer was found in Volume 2 of the Church History, published in 1992. Often the servants and slaves of early congregants were buried nearby in a plot just outside the North Cemetery wall. No records were kept. The statement that no records were kept is not entirely accurate. Records were kept, but very unevenly, and they take different forms. First, the stones themselves are a form of record. They provide tangible evidence of 15 burials, with names, dates with varying details, some with flowery inscriptions, and some family relationships mentioned. They had different styles as well. But there's one thing they all have in common. Someone cared enough when these people passed to arrange their final resting place here and to memorialize them with a stone. Some in the later years were no doubt provided by family members, but for others it was likely the family that employed them. So there's 14 markers, 15 people, as Susan and Edward Breckenridge share a stone. Parish registers are another type of record, a more traditional textual record. Here are a few early free-form entries before pre-printed books were in use. The earliest recorded burial of a person of color was Nellie, a black woman buried in 1795. We don't know where Nellie was buried because that is much earlier than even the churchyard wall was built or even proposed. The wife of John Breckenridge was buried in May of 1857. She's the first person with the surname Breckenridge in the register. She could have been an Alice Breckenridge, who appears in the district in the 1850 census as a free woman. That seems even more likely when you compare her entry to the next one. Servant Henry was buried in April 1860, belonging to the brothers Charles and Edward Lyon, prominent St. Thomas parishioners. His status as an enslaved man is clear from this entry. The final example is the burial of Selina, wife of Edward Breckenridge, colored on June 5, 1860, buried 6 weeks after Henry. The existence of an entry in the parish register was perhaps linked to participation of the rector in whatever form the service took place. So you can see the implied and explicit, I buried so-and-so on such and such a date, suggesting the rector's participation on those last 3 entries. So between the markers naming 15 people and the parish registers adding 14 additional names, we know of 29 burials, but we have a third source. So-called modern death certificates include the name of the cemetery. So by constructing family trees for the people known to be buried north of the wall, then looking for death dates and death certificates for their relatives, we've been able to add another 12 people to the list of known burials. But here's a key limiting factor in this research strategy. Baltimore City, like most urban jurisdictions, began keeping death records much earlier than rural jurisdictions. And that's because they had a health department and they were concerned with public sanitation and safety. So the city began keeping death records in 1875, but not until 1898 did the General Assembly pass a law requiring death registrations in the other 23 jurisdictions, including Baltimore County. And even then, compliance in rural areas was spotty, as I will show you later. So here are two examples. The earliest Baltimore County record I located for someone new to our list was the 1913 death certificate of Margaret Breckenridge, wife of John Breckenridge, a different John Breckenridge. Her parents were named Samuel Sheridan and Emmeline Charms. And that's usually the genealogist's holy grail when you're looking at death records. You want to find that mother's maiden name so you can push back another generation. But the presence and reliability of that information is highly dependent on the person who gave the information. More straightforward reporting is the place of burial located in the lower right-hand corner, and this says St. Thomas Cemetery. And while we may not find Margaret's burial in the parish register, we can find her marriage as Maggie Sheridan to John Breckenridge in church records. They were married at the rectory in 1878. Later that same year, Jack Stewart died at Mercy Hospital in Baltimore City. His burial at St. Thomas Garrison Forest is noted in that lower right-hand corner. His burial is recorded in the parish register, the first to refer explicitly to the colored burial ground. He was identified as an old servant of Mrs. Robert Elder. The more formal name John was used in this record. And the two records do vary a little bit in a couple of small details, that Jack versus John. The date of the death is different by 1 day. And the biggest difference is his age. The hospital reported his age as 35. The parish register as 65, but clearly it's the same man. So I zoomed in quickly on a couple of individuals to show you the sources that can be pieced together to identify burials. Attached to my written report is a spreadsheet identifying each of those known burials with information answering the following questions. Is there a marker? Was the burial recorded in the register? Was a death record found? So in the report, there are 41 known burials, 22 associated with the Breckenridge family, 5 with the Schuyler Doman Phipps family. There's a father, mother, and son with a surname Washington, and the rest so far are individuals, as far as I can tell. And most of those individuals can be linked to St. Thomas parishioners, but not all of them have yet been. So let's take a look at the Breckenridge burials. Here's a partial family tree for Edward Breckenridge that highlights in green those who are buried north of the wall. I showed the parish burial record for the wife of John Breckenridge here at the top. I don't have a line connecting her to anyone because I don't know how she is related. Perhaps John Breckenridge was Edward's brother. Edward did name a son John after all, and thus she is his sister-in-law perhaps. You saw a burial record for Selina, Edward's apparent first wife. Edward and his second wife, Susan, have the earliest dated marker north of the wall, with death dates in 1892 and 1893, respectively. Edward and Selina had 8 or 9 children. Only 3 are shown here. Most of the Breckenridge family members known to be buried here descend through his son John and his wife Margaret. John was a familiar sight at the parish. He took care of the horses during church services, accepting coins from parishioners for his services. He wasn't the only Breckenridge to work here. His likely nephew, William C. Breckenridge, was more formally hired in the 1890s to repair fencing and to plant trees in the cemetery and at the rectory. So from the earliest known Breckenridge burial in 1857 to Mary E. Breckenridge buried in 2012, that's a span of 155 years. How did the Breckenridge family come to have such a close identification with this burial ground? For that, we're going to turn to tracing the ownership of the property itself. This diagram, found among the church files, it's a good thing I was hired to do the inventory as well, identifies the parcels that make up the church property. The church is circled in yellow in the lower right. The area north of the cemetery, boxed in blue, is identified as having been conveyed from H.L. Durr in 1954 and is labeled Colored Cemetery. That 1954 deed refers back to multiple deeds involving John and Mary Patterson, and their names appear here prominently as well, having conveyed other property. Here's the list of transactions that goes along with that chart. The 1954 deed from Henry L. Durr for the 236 feet by 41 feet colored cemetery. Above the deeds you find are 1839 to 1863 from John and Mary Patterson. John and Mary B. Patterson, both themselves buried in the churchyard, lived at Adamasco, property that lies across Garrison Forest Road from the church. At one time, they owned over 700 acres. Here's a drawing of their house from a book of Green Spring Valley homes. The same drawing appears in the St. Thomas history book, identified as the home of Charles Carnan, an earlier owner of the property. Our second family tree. Mary B. Patterson, the wife of John Patterson, was the daughter of Wilson Carey Nicholas, governor of Virginia, and his wife, Margaret Smith, of the prominent Smith family of Baltimore. Her brother, General Samuel Smith, was a major political and military figure in Maryland from the 1770s until his death in 1839. I don't think there's an elected office that he didn't hold. For his part, John Patterson was the son of William Patterson, the second wealthiest man in Maryland, behind Charles Carroll of Carrollton. That also makes John the brother of Betsy Patterson Bonaparte, who was married to Napoleon's brother, Jerome, and quite an infamous character in her own right. Wilson Carey Nicholas and Margaret Smith had 9 children. 4 are shown here in light blue. Next to Mary, we have Sarah E. Nicholas, Mary's unmarried sister, who lived with John and Mary Patterson throughout her life. To the left is their sister Carrie Ann Nicholas, who was married to her first cousin, John Spear Smith, son of Samuel Smith. And to the right is John Nicholas Smith, the father of Wilson Carey Nicholas II, who was raised at Adamasco by his aunts Mary and Sarah. It was John Spear Smith who manumitted Selina Brown from slavery in 1831, and we know that because in 1848 she sought a certificate of freedom in Baltimore County Circuit Court, relying on the testimony of John Spear Smith's son. By then, her name was Serena Breckenridge. And indeed, we can find her in the 1850 census with 9 children. Priscilla, who bears the name Brown, perhaps born before her marriage to Edward, but the others carry the name Breckenridge: Harriet, Robert, Sarah, Sampson, Austin, Ellen, Rose, and Polly. They are all free, their legal status tied to hers. Edward is not with them, and he can't be found in the 1850 census. You already know that Selina died in 1860. She would have been about 43. Selina Breckenridge, as a free woman of color, wrote a will that intimately involves the Nicholas family and the son of the man who freed her. I give and bequeath to Sarah E. Nicholas all my goods and chattels, stock, farming utensils, and property of every description in trust for the sole use and benefit of my husband, Edward Breckenridge, during his natural life, and at his death to be at her sole use and disposition. And I appoint Sarah E. Nicholas sole guardian of my infant children. In the event of her death, I appoint J. Lewis Smith, son of John Spear Smith, guardian of my said children. Unable to sign her name, she made her mark. It's a close bond between Selina and Sarah. We can't know its exact nature, but Sarah was known for her good works. She is credited with organizing the first Sunday school at St. Thomas and reportedly taught many of the neighborhood children how to read and write. She and Debbie Owings were known for providing comforts for the poor, the sick, and the needy in the parish, delivering them by horseback. So why would Selina name a guardian for her children and a trustee for her husband? Selina's husband, Edward Breckenridge, had a close connection with Mary B. Patterson. In her will, dated 1865, Mary left all of her property to her sister Sarah. But in the event that Sarah predeceased her, it was to go to their nephew, Wilson Carey Nicholas. Mary made a revealing exception. For that portion of my farm at present leased to Edward Breckenridge and Salathe Cole, which portion together with the woodland between Edward Breckenridge's place and the den, I bequeath to my nephew, John G. Nicholas. We don't have a copy of the lease, but this clause, which was not triggered because in fact Sarah did outlive Mary, still tells us a lot. Edward leased land from her and had a place on that land where he lived. We don't know which woodland or what the den refers to, although I suspect it's a low area, maybe between the church and Anamasco. But this leasehold could very well include the property that abuts the churchyard wall. The clause also suggests that she took extra care to protect Edward's leasehold interest. As I showed you a few minutes ago, Edward was not enumerated with Selina in the 1850 census, so we're going to take a look at the 1850 slave schedule for the area surrounding the church. It shows the slaveholders' names, but for the slaves themselves, records only the age, gender, and color, whether black or mulatto. Here is John Patterson, among other families of the parish, excuse me, Lyon, Hollingsworth, Mole, Elder. We're going to take a closer look at John Patterson. He owned 14 slaves in all. The oldest was 67, and the youngest was 3 months. John Patterson died in 1851, and his wife, Mary B. Patterson, inherited his slaves. Her name appears as the slaveholder in 1860. By this time, the number of slaves has actually increased to 15. Putting them side by side, which I would welcome you to come look at. Thank you so much. I left mine over there. Thank you. We can do a reasonably good job mapping the two lists to each other. It's not a perfect match because close attention was not paid to exact ages and birth dates for enslaved people. Estimates were typical, but we do have a male age 35 in 1850 with no corresponding entry in 1860. It's entirely possible that Edward is that 35-year-old. On the left side of the screen is an image of the slave quarters at Adamasco, where Edward might have lived. We don't know when Selina wrote her will, only when it was presented to court, but perhaps her death prompted the sisters to free Edward, giving him the capacity to enter into a lease with Mary. There's no direct evidence that this is what happened, but I think the indirect evidence is strong. It seems more likely that Mary would lease property to one of her former slaves than to someone that she did not know well. And here Edward is, enumerated as a free man in 1860, heading a household of children that correlates to the list of children that appeared with Selina 10 years earlier. He's 45 years old, an exact match for a man enumerated as a 35-year-old slave in 1850. It should be noted that Edward, as well as several other older generation Breckenridge family members, reported a Virginia birthplace in the federal census, consistent with the theory that they arrived in Maryland held as chattel by the Nicholas sisters. At the bottom is 5-year-old John Breckenridge, the youngest child of Edward and Selina, who would marry Maggie Sheridan at the rectory in 1878. And he would have only been a toddler when his mother died. Let's look at the second family who has a cluster of burials here, the Schuyler, Doman, Phipps family. The known burials are shown in green. They use the name Doman at times, particularly in the first census immediately after emancipation. Ultimately, the female members of the family seemed to return to the name Schuyler, and the men held on to the name Doman. So this inquiry began with noting the 1940 burial of Richard Phipps in the parish register. Richard's death certificate identified Sarah Schuyler and Austin Phipps as his parents and his employer as Mr. DeVise, a St. Thomas parishioner. Sarah Phipps died a few years later in 1943. Her burial is also in the parish register. Sarah's husband, Austin Phipps, had died nearly a decade earlier. He is also buried there. according to his death certificate, but his name does not appear in the parish register. Sarah's death certificate identifies her mother as Sidney Schuyler. Tracing a generation further back through census records and probate records, we find the matriarch, Millie Schuyler. The African American community in proximity to the church was not surprisingly a close one. Millie's granddaughter, Sidney, her son Philip's daughter, married Robert Breckenridge, the grandson of Edward Breckenridge, at the St. Thomas Rectory in 1905. Not shown on this chart is the fifth family member of the Schuyler-Doman Phipps family, Eliza Doman, apparently the wife of Millie's son, Charles, and she died in Baltimore City in 1904. So let's return to the Nicholas family and update its composition. Wilson Carey Nicholas II, nephew of Mary Patterson and Sarah Nicholas, married Augusta Mole in 1866. Augusta was the daughter of Samuel Mole and niece of Robert North Mole. It was Robert North Mole who freed by will Millie Schuyler at his death in 1853. Her daughters, Louisa, Sidney, Christina, and Lydia, were to receive their freedom at the age of 31. Thus, the two white families associated with the two black families were themselves linked by marriage. Robert's daughter Ellen, married to George Elder, was her father's sole heir, and Millie was still in the family's employ in 1898 when she was mentioned in the volume 1 of the church history on page 144. Aunt Millie, an old family servant, now over 90, who has seen 6 generations of the Mole family, remembers quite well when Mrs. Mole used to come every summer to the country. Several of Millie's children worked for Ellen's daughters and their husbands for decades. Austin Phipps, who was born in Virginia, worked for Ellen's daughter, Frances Shipley, before marrying Sarah Schuyler, Millie's granddaughter. Ellen Elder's son, Robert North Elder, employed Jack Stewart, who was buried north of the wall in 1913. His death certificate was one of the 2 I showed you earlier. So the St. Thomas families intertwined over multiple generations, dual communities with vastly different life circumstances. Returning to the question of the land itself, Sarah E. Nicholas died in 1878, and she left the real property that she had inherited from her sister Mary to her nephew, Wilson Carey Nicholas. After he died in 1908, his widow, Augusta Mole Nicholas, acquired title to the property, and when she died in 1924, the property was inherited by their children, who in turn conveyed it to Henry Durr in 1929. 2 years later, in 1931, Durr offered the land north of the cemetery wall to St. Thomas as a gift. 23 years later, in 1954, the deed was executed. Mr. Hall Harrison, the church warden, noted that the vestry had dilly-dallied without specifying a reason. Hard to believe. So if we think of this as a jigsaw puzzle, we would say at this point that most of the perimeter and large chunks of it are in place. Some pieces are spread out on the table, some are still in the box, and some may have fallen on the floor and gotten swept away. But information will continue to come to light. And here's what I was planning to say next. I was going to say it is likely, for instance, that Millie Schuyler is buried north of the cemetery wall. But I decided to try a search last week in the Baltimore Sun on Aunt Millie. And lo and behold, we have another name for that spreadsheet. Permilla Schuyler, better known as Aunt Millie or Gran, who cooked in the Elder family for 5 generations, died in 1899, the year after she appeared in the church history. And according to the paper, was shown an unusual amount of respect. Her funeral was held at the Green Spring Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, but her body was laid to rest in the cemetery adjoining St. Thomas. Her grave was covered with flowers by the young ladies in attendance. Reverend Hobart Smith was here, as well as members of the Elder and Nicholas family. The paper also reported that many of the white people present wept bitterly. There's no marker, there's no entry in the parish register, and no death certificate, even though the law required one by that time. Here, the newspaper serves as our 4th type of source. So we can update the Schuyler tree to show Millie's box shaded in green and with her full name, Permilla. So we are up to 42 known burials, including 6 now from the Schuyler, Doman, Phipps family. Millie was just one of 7 people that I identified in my report as likely buried here based on circumstantial evidence. Another one was Lucy Breckenridge. She was born in Virginia, according to the census. She was age 90 in 1870. We don't see her in the census until after emancipation. She could be the oldest female tick mark that appeared on the Patterson slave schedules, and she could be Edward's mother. So each type of record we discussed has gaps. There are graves out there without markers. The parish register did not include all burials. The death record date for Baltimore County as compared with the city leaves a gap. The death of Permilla, with her long service to a prominent family, she was very well known, merited a news story, but certainly the burials of most servants would not. So how can these gaps be filled? And I'm not here advocating for additional work at this time. I just want you to be aware of how additional information could emerge in the future, and that I hope that you will keep your minds and hearts open for that. Deeper research into some of the individuals on the list could reveal additional burials, just as it did for the Breckenridge and Schuylers. My newspaper research was limited to the easily accessible Baltimore Sun, but there are other local newspapers so far only available on microfilm. Someday, perhaps, they'll be digitized and searchable. I have a feeling that many parish families have their own papers, either still in their possession or at repositories. Another source that could fill in some gaps are funeral home records. Death certificates identify undertakers, and a pursuit someday of any existing records, and they're not all still available, but could tell us more about who is buried and who was making arrangements for burials. The markers themselves could give us some clues. Amelia Nevitt, buried in 1927, and John Butler, buried in 1931, have the same style marker. If we could figure out who made the marker and who made those arrangements, maybe that would tell us something about their connection to the parish. Serendipity and outreach could add to the list. One St. Thomas parishioner put Tom and then me in touch with a man who said his grandmother, Elizabeth Lee, was buried there. He didn't know the exact date. He was a child when she died, but it didn't take long to find her death certificate, which confirmed his memory. There may be others who know of their own family's link to the burial ground. And by the way, serendipity is a highly technical genealogical term for discoveries made in ways that we cannot explain. And it happens more than you might think. The term custom and usage came to mind while I was preparing for today. The definition from Black's Law Dictionary reads, a usage or practice of the people which by common adoption and acquiescence and by long and unvarying habit has become compulsory and has acquired the force of law with respect to the place or subject matter to which it relates. It goes on to say, it results from a long series of actions constantly repeated, which have by such repetition acquired the force of tacit and common consent. Tacit meaning without explicit discussion. So we are left to deduce the larger perspective from the events that can be documented. And here are some of my own thoughts, but there is certainly room for others, and I'm sure you will all be discussing this in the days and weeks to come. The legal status of those buried before emancipation and the practice of segregation that separated people in the following years underlies the usage of that strip of land. And although generally access to plots in the churchyard and the new cemetery was reserved for church members, in 1891 the vestry adopted a policy of allowing poor, respectable white persons to get a free single grave within the walls. Breckenridge burials were viewed in a different light than other burials due to the family's close association with the owners of the land, its historic identification with a home nearby, and the early stone placed to honor Edward and Susan. Over the years, burials of servants of other parishioners proceeded. With its adjacency to the church wall, it was a natural fit. The term colored burial ground, used in the register for the first time in 1913, implies a church affiliation, but the land did not even yet belong to the church. Duer's offer of the land in 1931 was an acknowledgement of the established usage. The lag of time between the offer and the execution reflects sort of a lack of urgency in matching the legal status to the usage. And it was a gift, so there was no money involved. The existence and the use of the area north of the churchyard wall as a burial ground for African Americans associated with parish members was generally unquestioned, at least in documented discourse. Now, the steps that you are taking now to openly reflect on that are important ones, and I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in that process. So,
I don't have a question, but I want to thank you. Really, fantastic.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed, as I said to several of you, I enjoyed the process of putting it together using a 21-page written report to try to turn it into something that, would be more of a story. And it really allowed me to focus on the themes that I thought emerged. So it really was a work in progress, and I enjoyed doing it.
I'm curious, so you mentioned a Henry Duer. I think we pronounce that Duer.
Duer, okay.
It's an old family around here.
Okay, thank you.
It's such a small plot of land. How did Henry Duer end up with that?
Well, he bought a larger piece of property from the Nicholas descendants.
Right next to the church here.
Yes. And would anybody like me to go back to a family tree or anything? And you're welcome to come up and talk to me afterwards, and I can do that. We're certainly not running out the door, yes?
I'm curious to know how much went into estate and trust records in the Maryland, the Baltimore County Ordinance Court, for example, to see, there's a lot of stuff about people's estates going, I don't know, certainly back to the 18th century or 19th century.
Well, this is a question about estates and trusts and how much research was done in there. Obviously, for people who were enslaved, having to look at probate records for the white families is critical. And so that is, obviously that's how I found Robert Northmold's, will. So, and saw the explicit reference to Millie and her family. And I think also her son, I didn't mention him, but she also had a son, Philip, who was mentioned in the will. And then looking at the inventory and in fact seeing those people listed on the will. And of course, some of those would have been freed before their 31st birthday because emancipation came in the meantime. But that's really the critical source for tracing enslaved African Americans are white families' probate records, because they are listed, and typically without last names. I don't think they, like in the inventory, even though the African Americans had last names, it's just that the white records didn't often refer to them. They knew what their last names were. I just read an article yesterday that said that actually the African Americans referred to those as their titles. Those were names that they carried for decades, and a lot of times people think that they use the names of their last slaveholder, but they really had historic names that dated back, 100 years. So I think that, yeah, serendipity, there you go. I think there's more that probably could be learned from, looking at more broadly parish members. It was obviously a landowning, wealthy community, and, it was a widespread practice. And so I think the papers of many of the lead, I also went, obviously the family that lived at the caves, the Carroll family, there's extensive papers down at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, and I spent a lot of time looking at those records, looking to see if they mentioned, certainly John Patterson was mentioned. I was looking to see if there were any, transactions that involved some of the Patterson enslaved. There's a lot more that could be done, I think. Yes? No, it was Wilson Carey Nicholas was the governor of Virginia, and he was the parent of the Nicholas sisters, and Mary Nicholas was married to John Patterson. Governor, I learned a lot doing this, as always, but Wilson Carey Nicholas himself ended up destitute, and his good friend Thomas Jefferson actually tried to bail him out, and himself ended life being in reduced circumstances. And Wilson Carey Nicholas is actually buried at Monticello. So there was just lots of these, the wealthy families that intermarried with each other had very complex financial relationships with each other. I think John Patterson put his property into trust the year that his father died, because my sense was that William died and John had a lot of creditors, and once his father died, that he would have been exposed to his creditors. So he very quickly created a trust and put all of his property, his property and Mary's property, with Sarah as the trustee. So I think it was a mechanism to protect his assets from creditors. Yes, sir.
I was just curious if after the emancipation, if any of the people continued on with the same families.
Someone asked about whether or not people continued service with the same families. That certainly was true of Millie Schuyler. I see there was another person, we know a specific name of someone enslaved by Mary Patterson, Emmanuel Spriggs. He had gone off to enlist in the colored troops, and so that actually appeared in the paper, and he is found, very nearby, in the following year censuses. I mean, they had very deep roots in the area themselves, and their families were here, so they wouldn't have been the ones who were, striking out west or anything like that in most cases. But people did go into the city, of course, to seek employment, and so that's why I did find some early death certificates. Maybe some stayed out here, but others went into the city to seek employment, but yet maintained their roots out here, with their family.
Melissa, do you think it's possible that when the vestry dilly-dallied for so long, they did so because they did not want to assume the responsibility of the colored cemetery?
Jean Baker asked the question of whether or not I thought the dilly-dally, had a specific purpose. I can't answer that question. I think maybe some people here might know more about that than I would. I guess it was a long time ago, but do vestries tend to dilly-dally about things? I don't know.
I just find your presentation was amazing, and I want to say thank you to it. And I'm sure I'll look back on it again.
Yes.
But my question is, if I heard you correctly, the plot was owned by someone and burials took place before it belonged to the church.
Well, that's correct.
So I wonder if that was the intent to bury people there, or if they just thought so much of that family that they had to have a place for them, or...
Well, I think that family owned the property originally, and a lot of the property that the church is on. So I think it was acquired piecemeal, maybe as the church was expanding. And then, that usage was established by practice. And then I think that once Henry, I guess he was a church member, however you said, Dewar, he was a church member, but maybe, he perhaps didn't want the responsibility. And so when the decision was made to stop accepting burials from the Breckenridge family, it was a realization that there was no technical legal right to burial on that property. It was really, again, just this practice that had grown up, and the Breckenridges, there was a certain expectation they had about being allowed to continue family burials there, and then the church reflected upon the fact that had never been laid out as a cemetery. I'm not even sure how they know how much of the ground is actually taken up by burials. So I think that's another question of the physical examination of the property itself. Yes, there were some mention in the parish register about specific burials, but where exactly people who are buried whose graves aren't marked, I don't know how I don't know how they know that. So perhaps further use of the property was just deemed so difficult that it was, better to sort of back off from that continuing relationship.
And are there any, maybe someone else can answer this, or the cemetery, I don't know who's here, any records kept as to who were tithing and how they came about getting certain plots of land?
Oh, you mean in the, within the churchyard itself?
Yes.
There's very detailed cemetery records and cards and deeds to the plots and,
But I was wondering if there was a correlation between the ownership and the tithe.
well, I don't think that the property outside the church wall wasn't laid out as a cemetery. I had never seen this chart before today over on the wall, and that, I was kind of wondering whether anything on the right-hand side might have referred to any extraneous burials. I was tempted to get a ladder and go over there and take a look, but I decided not to do it today in case I fell down. But, I don't think that property was laid out in the same sort of concrete way. And in fact, didn't belong to the church, again, until very recently.
So, was the property north of the wall, was that originally part of Athabasca?
Yes, I would say so. Yes, it was part of.
And the Breckenridge family originated, as far as I can tell, more or less from Athabasca.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it started by Athabasca,
And then.
and then it just continued.
Right, and then it evolved. I mean, it's a kind of a natural fit. We have the cemetery here, and so just to be outside the wall, it's just sort of consistent. And again, with the close connections among the White families, if the Nicholas family is, their practice was that, these folks were buried out there, then, other parishioners. So I'm, the last non-Breckenridge burial out there is in 1969. Which was the Filipino houseboy of someone who belonged to the church. And I think that's the last, I checked that this morning, the last non-Breckenridge burial that's out there in that area. That we know about.
Nellie, isn't it right, Nellie is buried there?
Well, the trick with Nellie at 1795, but there was no wall in 1795. The wall, I think, wasn't finished until 1832. And there's certainly large gaps where we don't see any records. If you look at this, I have to look at the spreadsheet over and over again and kind of try to notice different details about, but there's large gaps where there was, for all we know, it was being used extensively earlier, but we just don't know.
Melissa, are you able to stick around for a little
Yeah,
while
yeah, sure.
for more questions? Since people are starting to trickle out, I just wanted, on behalf of all of us, to say thank you again to Melissa. And second, I want to tell you that the Cemetery Unity Committee is continuing its work, chaired by our senior warden, Jessie Van Giesen, who is away on business and is very sorry she can't be here with us in person. But we are very carefully moving forward, most recently meeting with a landscape architect to begin to look at that space and how we might honor it more appropriately. And then finally, we do have printed copies of the report that Melissa put together for us. And I'm going to ask Bob Kenyon, if you don't mind, they are right there on the windowsill. As you're leaving, if you'd like to have a copy of the report, you're welcome to take one home. And this journey continues.
But don't forget to add Millie into your.
And don't forget to add Millie,
or
absolutely.
Pramila. And I will send you an updated copy with the updates. Thank you.